Welcome to the From Harm to Healing podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jones, and I'm a therapist who runs the From Harm to Healing treatment program, an online program for men who have engaged in infidelity or compulsive sexual behaviors within the context of an intimate relationship. I started this podcast to illuminate some of the common blind spots within the treatment fields for compulsive sexual behavior or sex addiction through the lens of the deceptive sexuality trauma model. I hope you find this resource enlightening, particularly if you're somebody navigating the pain of betrayal and deception for yourself. Thank you for listening to the From Harm to Healing podcast. In today's episode, I want to talk about a topic that I think is extremely important, is very central to the work I do, but that I think gets overlooked when we think about the healing process, or at least gets overlooked to a fairly significant degree. And that is the idea of internal versus external motivation, or specifically in my case, thinking of the men that I work with in my programs. What is their motivation for doing the work? Why are they coming to my program? Why are they working with me? And the reality is that for most men who start doing this kind of work, so for the men that work with me or men joining other SA programs or whatever it might be, it really starts from a place generally of external motivation, usually because there has been a discovery of the secret sexual reality. And so there's significant rupture, significant distress occurring within the relationship, and they are facing perhaps significant external consequences to the behaviors. So again, starts with a high degree of external motivation. And it really makes sense that if we consider that the secret sexual reality that has likely been discovered has probably been going on for quite a period of time and has perhaps been internally justified for so long by the person engaging in that behavior, that it takes an external shift for something to change, for the motivation to go and do something about this to actually happen. And then what we need to consider alongside this is, what is the level of internal motivation? What is the motivation internally for the person to actually do this work? Because external motivation is very powerful. Again, if there are significant consequences occurring, significant distress within the relationship, it makes sense that that is a very powerful driver. That can be the thing that starts the journey. But I would always say that external motivation, whilst powerful, is not necessarily long-lasting. It might well get you started on the journey, but it won't see you through the journey if there isn't also an internal motivation developing to go alongside that. And my experience would be that for men I work with who are clearly working very much from an external motivation, the risk is that it can quickly lead to either resentment or complacency. So resentment can occur if I am doing a program, or if I am working with a therapist or doing something for purely external reasons. Let's say I'm doing it because my partner is pushing me to do it. I'm doing it to placate my partner. Then when things don't get better in the way I'm hoping, it can quickly turn to resentment, to an attitude of, I'm doing the things you've asked me to do, why aren't we moving forward? That is a very real risk when I'm essentially doing it for somebody else. The other side of it is complacency. If I'm externally motivated, let's say I'm doing it purely because of the distress I'm experiencing in my relationship. Well, as the relationship perhaps naturally ebbs and flows, and maybe there are times when things are a bit more peaceful or calm, I'm very likely to become complacent because the thing that is driving me to do the work is not there in that moment. The distress is not there. And when that is happening, we're actually perhaps unintentionally putting all of the pressure on the partner to see progress happen, because my work, the engagement with therapy on my side, or the engagement with the recovery work I need to do, is purely dependent upon her level of distress and anger. That's putting an extreme level of pressure, an unfair pressure on the partner to drive the progress. Now, conversely, if I'm working from a place of internal motivation, perhaps alongside that external motivation, there is less risk of these things. I am less likely to become resentful because I am doing this for me. I am working on my recovery because I recognize this is what I need to do. It is not dependent on seeing change necessarily in my partner, my relationship, to keep me going forward. In terms of the complacency, similarly, if I have a high degree of internal motivation to want to work on myself, to want to grow, then what is temporarily going on in the relationship won't be the defining factor of the work I'm putting in. When things are good, I'm going to continue working. And when things are tough, I'm going to continue working. And so it's fair to say, and I think it's quite obvious when we think about it in this way, that the biggest predictor of change for the clients I work with is the level of internal motivation that they are approaching the work with. And actually, if we zoom out and think about the therapeutic field in general, and particularly look into the research into therapeutic outcomes, we will see a similar story forming in general for pretty much all therapeutic work. So in my initial humanistic therapeutic training, there is a high degree of focus on the quality of the therapeutic relationship itself, the relationship between the therapist and the client, as being such a significant factor in the client outcomes. And indeed, a significant amount of research backs up the idea that the quality of the relationship between the therapist and client is more important, for example, than the specific methodology that's used. However, the research would also show that even more important than that, the biggest factor in client outcomes is the client's level of motivation and the client's level of engagement with the therapy. So more important than the model or methodology that we're using, more important than the relationship between the therapist and the client, the most important factor is the level of client motivation and engagement. There is a pretty terrible but also pretty instructive therapist joke that goes, how many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? Just one, but the light bulb has to really want to change. Now, firstly, I apologize for that joke. And secondly, again, really pointing to that idea, there is an important message in there that the client's desire to do the work, willingness to change and really do the difficult things in order to change are the most important factor by far in any therapeutic work. And so it's a really important question for anybody approaching therapy, but particularly in this case for men considering doing this kind of work, the DST model, perhaps working in my program. What is the internal motivation? What is the willingness to change? And I would challenge each person to consider what their expectations are when they're going to therapy or when they're attending a group or, again, taking part in a program. Are you going there to be fixed or to think of the therapist, the facilitator, as someone who can treat you or fix you in the way that you would perhaps go to a doctor if you had an illness? If that's the attitude or the expectation, then I think the danger is the potential of the work is already being undermined, because when we're in that place, we're outsourcing the effort, we're outsourcing the work. We are looking at someone else to perhaps fix the problem for us, rather than really looking at it as a tool for me to engage in and me to work at. And so I would always argue that we should think of a therapist, or again, any kind of therapeutic resource, more like a physiotherapist or a personal trainer than a doctor, let's say. It's not someone we go to who's going to do something to us or give us something to fix us or heal us. It is someone we're going to that we can work with and who can give us the tools, the resources, the space to be able to do that work. So if we go to a physio or a personal trainer, they could be the greatest physio or personal trainer in the world. They could give us all the best tools, If we don't engage with those tools, if we don't really engage and put the effort in, there will not be good results. It's impossible. So really, this is a personal challenge, especially to any men or any people listening to this who have built, maintained a secret sexual basement, who are facing this reality, to really consider why you are doing that. Why are you doing the work? Or why are you even listening to this podcast, let's say? We know through this model, and again, if you've listened to previous episodes or engaged with this work previously, that we're identifying an AVT reality here, an abuse victim trauma reality. This is not just a compulsive sexual problem. This is an abuse victim trauma reality. Great harm has been caused, and a lot of work needs to be done to face up to that harm and to start providing those conditions where healing can occur. And so it's always really important to genuinely ask ourselves why we are approaching that AVT reality. Why are we approaching something that is difficult, that is challenging to approach, that is uncomfortable? Are we doing it to placate someone else? Are we doing it for those external reasons? Or are we really choosing to face that from an internally motivated place? Because that is where real change can start happening. We can make no guarantees about outcomes in the relationship, but real change can happen for an individual who is internally motivated to face up to this work and really engage in it. Now, when I do assessments for people who are interested in being a part of my program, this is one of the main questions we actually go through is, what is your level of internal motivation versus external motivation? What is your willingness to commit to the program, to make sacrifices to do this work? And so I'm going to briefly read through a couple of paragraphs from a resource that I use within the program, which really just succinctly explains some of what I've said there. So hopefully it's helpful. So on internal versus external motivation. Most men seeking treatment for deceptive sexuality do so with a high degree of external motivation. After having avoided the reality of the behaviors for so long, and potentially having justified or rationalized them internally, it often takes an external rupture and the severity of the consequences within the intimate relationship to motivate any attempts towards healing. One of the best predictors of genuine progress and change throughout the therapeutic process, however, is the person's level of internal motivation. External motivation is a very powerful force that should be harnessed as much as possible. However, there will come a point where external motivation itself isn't enough, and in some cases might ultimately lead to resentment. When internal motivation develops and the desire to change is an internally driven process, genuine, lasting change is far more likely. Moving from external to internal motivation is often a journey and is something you should keep in mind throughout this entire treatment process. And then on priority and sacrifice. It's easy to say that you're willing to do whatever it takes throughout this recovery process. However, in reality, some significant sacrifices are likely to be required throughout this process that require more than just words or intent. Each person engaging with this form of treatment should spend some time honestly considering the level of priority they're attaching to this and the level of sacrifice they're willing to make in aid of treatment. If somebody states that this is their number one priority, but is then unwilling to make the sacrifices required, they're still displaying a lack of congruence or integrity, and therefore still not moving towards a healthy psychology. I hope that there's some real food for thought there for the people listening to this, and again, particularly for the men or people who have engaged in deceptive sexuality and are considering the treatment journey ahead, are considering the path forward towards healing. As a final note here on today's episode, I do want to acknowledge how difficult, how gut-wrenching this topic alone can be for the betrayed partners. If you are a partner who has been harmed by deceptive sexuality, how hard it can be to have to sit with this challenge of knowing that there is a battle between internal and external motivation. Perhaps feeling like you only really see your partner engaging in the work that he needs to do when you really push, feeling like you're having to lead that recovery for him. And what a bind that can be, where you know it's his work to do. You're perhaps desperate for him to be motivated to do the work, but also recognizing that if you don't push, then it won't happen. And I have so much empathy for partners stuck in that position. I would say it's actually one of the most painful parts of this work, when you can see how desperate a partner is to see progress, to see safety, to see healing, especially when people have built a life together, people have children and homes and finances. There's a lot to lose and a lot to be gained if progress can be made. And there's really no simple answer to this bind, but all I would encourage is to remember to recognize that this is his work, that for real change to happen, it needs to be internally motivated, and you have the right to set boundaries, to set expectations around that, to value yourself in that situation, and to really see the level of engagement with the work, or with this kind of model even, from your partner as evidence, as concrete evidence of who they are striving to be, and how much they are really valuing you and valuing the relationship. And so the final point I will make is that actions will always tell a bigger story than a person's words. Thank you for listening to this episode of the From Harm to Healing podcast. If you'd like to find out more information about the deceptive sexuality trauma model itself, you can visit minwalamodel.com. If you're interested in the services that I offer, in particular the From Harm to Healing treatment program, please visit chrisjonestherapy.co.uk.